Putin clearly was flustered by this, and they had a number of shows of him talking to his senior security people and so on, and he clearly wasn't in a good mood. The awkward thing for Russia, this is relevant because the way people talk about dangers of escalation and so on, is he needs to play this down. I mean, the more he talks it up and then finds it difficult to deal with, the more it does seem like a Ukrainian victory.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by the highly respected historian and academic Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. He's also the author of Command, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine, and you can read his Substack, which is called Comment is Freed. Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, welcome to Frontline.
Hi.
First of all, I wonder if you can just give us your assessment of the past few weeks, specifically the incursion into Kursk. Here we are almost 3 weeks into the offensive. What is your analysis of it?
So I think what's happened is that Ukraine was in quite a difficult position at the start of end of July, start of August. It had been on the defensive all year. The Russians were pushing quite hard into Donetsk, which is one of the provinces of Ukraine that the Russians claim for themselves. And though they inflicted terrible casualties on the Russians, it was tough for them too, and they were being pushed back. And it was very hard to see how they could take any initiatives of their own, possibly until next year. They needed to replenish their army and so on. And then out of the blue, really, most people were quite surprised by this. On the 6th of August, they launched an attack into Russia, into Kursk. And this got the Russians by surprise, got the Americans by surprise, got a lot of Ukrainians by surprise. They've kept this going now for 3 weeks. They've taken a substantial chunk of territory. They're still expanding pretty slowly now. And though the Russians are starting to fight back, it's going to take quite a long time before the Russians can muster the force and organize it to push them out. Meanwhile, the Russians haven't stopped where they're strong, and indeed their advance has picked up pace. So the war is rather curiously poised at the moment. You've got a very strong push by the Russians, which may see some success quite soon. But you've also got this new initiative by the Ukrainians, which complicates Russian strategy enormously, because it's embarrassing for Putin to have Ukrainians occupying a bit of Russia. Meanwhile, you've also got attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, really severe ones on Monday and Tuesday, and Ukraine is fighting back by hitting Russian oil. So there's a lot of tit for tat going on at the moment. Nobody quite in a position to move towards a victory, but a lot of damage and destruction.
Are you clear what the primary objective from a Ukrainian point of view was with the incursion? Was it designed to divert Russian troops? Was it designed to humiliate Putin? Or was it primarily designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western allies of, look, we can physically invade Russia, and all of Putin's talk about red lines will be shown to be a bluff?
I think all of those things. It was, I think, partly morale sounds like it's not a very good reason, but actually it's not unimportant. They had to show that they could do something, and just to relieve the pressure. Secondly, and President Zelensky talked about this yesterday, he wants to create a buffer of some sort. There's an issue about whether the Ukrainians feared another Russian invasion coming through either Kharkiv or Sumy. They tried one in Kharkiv a few months ago, which didn't actually go very well. But the Ukrainians now say they want a buffer of some sort to make those sort of incursions harder. I think they really do want the Russians to move troops out of Ukraine, and some have already moved out of Ukraine. But fortunately for the Ukrainians, not quite the ones that they would wish, the ones carrying on the main offensive at the moment. So I think there were a number of reasons why they wanted to do it. They also, again, this is not minor, they've taken 500 to 600 prisoners, and many of them conscripts, and they've already swapped um, well over 100 of those for Ukrainian prisoners. So they call it their exchange fund. Um, that you don't get much out of the Russians unless you've got something to offer in return.
And you mentioned that, and it is worth noting, for all the morale boost of the Kursk incursion, that Russia are still making incremental gains in Donetsk around Pokrovsk. And I think that is important to note, isn't it?
Yes, and it's serious. I mean, it's not. Now, Zelensky said yesterday not that they can stop the Russians advancing more, um, even into Pokrovsk, which is the target city, but that they can't take all of Donetsk. So he's sort of raised the bar a bit for the Russians in terms of what constitutes a victory. It's a I mean, there's a question as to whether Ukraine would have been able to get in the people that have attacked um, Kursk into positions to do too much about uh, Donetsk, just simply because of the problems of moving people into positions. The thing about this battlefield is every movement is watched. It's very hard to do very much surreptitiously. Even the movement into Kursk uh, was sort of hidden a bit because the best explanation, I think, for the Russians was that this was another defensive move by Ukrainians. They didn't just expect the Ukrainians would have the nerve to try what they tried. But if you know what they do, what a unit is doing, and you've got drones all over the place, then they soon become pretty vulnerable.
I heard an analyst say the other day that the Kursk incursion has sort of shown two different military philosophies almost butting heads. You've got General Syrskyi deploying, in essence, a kind of maneuver warfare with the Kursk incursion, and you've got Russia still, with its incremental gains, going for attritional warfare on the front line in Ukraine. Do you agree with that?
To a point, I mean, I think both the senior Russian and Ukrainian commanders were products of the Soviet system. Um, Ukraine just doesn't have the manpower to do it like Russia. I mean, Russia's tactics are extraordinarily wasteful on human life. They just throw people uh, and fire at the target until it's overwhelmed. The Ukrainians just can't afford to do that. In some places they've tried, and the losses have been heavy. So the Ukrainians do need to manoeuvre more than just rely on attrition, or at least rely on attrition to the extent that the Russians keep on pouring forward and they can keep on taking them out until the point where they can do maneuver, which is what people were expecting before the Kursk incursion. Maneuver is very difficult, though. I mean, this is what the Ukrainians discovered last summer, 2023, when they tried quite a big offensive towards the south of Ukraine, and they just got pushed back. They just couldn't break through. Uh, so again, you come to the problem of the transparent battlefield. Uh, that it's much harder to get surprised. You, what you're doing can be watched all the time, and these days with modern artillery, to some extent aircraft, you can drones as well. You can direct fire very quickly at anything you see. So it's quite hard to do maneuver. This is why I think the Kursk incursion appeared as such an opportunity, because they thought they really could get surprised and they could see that the defensive lines were very thin. They probably now got almost as far as they're going to go with that for that reason. But they keep on. I mean, the other thing they can do is keep the Russians guessing where they might next try something. So they've reports this morning that they've been pushing in another Russian province, Belgorod. Um, a lot of Russian bloggers are worried that if they move troops away from southern Ukraine, the Ukrainians will try there. So it's hard to do what the Ukrainians want to do. It helps a lot if you can get Russian troops out of the way before you try.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point about Belgorod and a potential cross-border attack there. I think I read the same report. Certainly, the Institute for the Study of War have been
Yeah.
noting it. Um, what is the significance of choosing Belgorod?
Only that it's a bordering province. It's from where the Russians mounted an attack uh, earlier this year against Kharkiv, which didn't actually do that well, but it caught the Ukrainians a bit by surprise. So if you want to create buffers, these are the places to do it. I think it's accessible and a way to keep the Russians on their toes. If you don't want them to pour everything either into Donetsk or Kursk, well, give them something else to worry about.
Yeah, and of course, parts of Belgorod have already been evacuated as well.
Yeah, yeah. The Russians are very jumpy at the moment about this, and this is why it's embarrassing for Putin because, at the very least, you, given the way that this started, he's not exactly being able to look after his own people. And there's quite a lot of anger in these provinces, which a bit out of the way. They often feel neglected by Moscow anyway. That they're not being protected.
Well, let's focus on Vladimir Putin's position and the Russian response. First of all, has it surprised you, Sir Lawrence, that it's taken a long time for Russia? I mean, we haven't really seen them push back against the Ukrainians in Kursk. Okay, we saw this large scale drone and missile attack in towns and cities across Ukraine in the past 72 hours or so, but we haven't really seen a major counteroffensive in Kursk. Have you been surprised by the slowness of the Russian response?
It's just difficult. So they have pushed back, and there's been some quite intense battles in some places. And I think the Ukrainians have had mixed fortunes after the first week or so. I mean, they're still pushing on because there's plenty of places for them to push, but not as much as before. So there has been some pushback. The calculation suggests that for a proper counteroffensive, the Russians probably need 50,000 troops available. Um, the Ukrainians were saying yesterday that they reckon about 30,000 troops have been moved out of Ukraine into the area. There's difficulty for Putin to use conscripts, which is also what tends to be available, partly because there tends to be a promise that conscripts won't actually be used in battle, but also they're just not very well trained. So I think that a number of more serious Russian commentators realized from the start that this was going to take weeks, months before they can put it right, which is probably one reason why they're just pressing ahead with what they can do at the moment, on the grounds that if they if they're stuck with Ukrainians in Russia, they can at least take a bit more of Ukraine.
And let's say Ukraine was able to push further into Belgorod and launch a full scale incursion akin to what we've seen in Kursk. How politically embarrassing would that be for Putin to have essentially two oblasts occupied?
Yeah, I'd be surprised if they were able to get very far, but it certainly would be embarrassing. And Putin clearly was flustered by this, and they had a number of shows of him talking to his senior security people and so on, and he clearly wasn't in a good mood. Uh, the awkward thing for Russia, this is relevant because the way people talk about dangers of escalation and so on, is he needs to play this down. I mean, the more he talks it up and then finds it difficult to deal with, the more it does seem like a Ukrainian victory. So the tendency is to play it down. So this is what happens in war. It's normal. We can cope. We can manage. It's a tiny slither of Russia. We're a massive country, and so on. So that is part of his inclination not to talk up the danger until the point where they can deal with it. Then he'll explain why this battle is going on Russian territory.
And he's in a very difficult situation. I mean, if you take your figure of 50,000 troops needed in order to repel the incursion into Kursk, I mean, where is he going to get those from? You either have to divert from the front line or use conscripts, which, as you've outlined, Lawrence, is very difficult, or a fresh wave of mobilization. But that's politically very risky for him.
It is, and I think you're. I mean, that was immediately after the incursion. There was quite a bit of talk about mobilisation, which again I think got dampened down. The basic problem is there's labour shortages now in Russia. Um, to recruit people, they're offering large amounts of money, and word gets back about what's likely to happen to you if you go to the front line, which isn't good. So they're finding it harder to recruit people, say, voluntarily. There's fewer people that can be sort of press ganged into service. So they can sort of keep it ticking over, but they do have a problem, and there are now, the economy is overheating. They're pushing up defence production, so they need workers for the factories as well. Public utilities are suffering. We saw a few months ago a major terrorist attack, which indicated the interior forces are depleted as well. So it's a problem for Putin that the very wasteful approaches they use to fighting their wars mean that they've squandered a lot of their assets,
And on the
including
point
humans.
about Russia's manpower problems, I mean, we've been talking for years really on Frontline about the Russian casualty rates and, people questioning whether it's sustainable. And there has been this sense, well, it's sustainable because they can just keep chucking people into the meat grinder and they're not so bothered about casualty rates and all that kind of stuff. But of course, something is sustainable until it isn't. And now we've seen this incursion into Kursk. Are we now at that tipping point where actually the chickens are coming home to roost and the casualties are starting to be felt?
I mean, you put it correctly, I think, before. It isn't until it isn't. And I don't think we've got a very good view of the tipping point. The public opinion polling in Russia exists, but how reliable it is questionable. It suggests, the studies of public opinion suggest that it's in decline. The people are fed up. They would like peace. I mean, they would like the war to be over. They're not going to come out and say that Ukraine is a victim and we're at fault. But they'd be keen to see it over. But Putin is in command of the politics of Russia. He's got his own people surrounding him. There's no obvious contenders for power. So even if there's a lot of grumbling and unhappiness, there's not a lot that I think just ordinary people can do about it. I think it's more a question of the cumulative pressures of the war building up, including on the economy, and this may take some time. And there's a couple of things to watch for. First, if they are successful in Donetsk, I mean, seriously successful, will he use that as an opportunity to say, look, we've done pretty well now. This is the moment to strike a deal. What's the relevance of the American election? A month or so ago, I guess he was pretty optimistic that he'd be able to deal with Trump, who I don't think he finds particularly easy to deal with, but at least is somebody who wants to deal with Putin. Harris is a different bet, and no reason why the Harris administration would be any different from the Biden administration and not be willing to reward Russia for its aggression. So I think it's a cumulative process rather than a particular factor which tips over. And it may take some time. I mean, I've been very wary about predicting how this war will end for some time. Neither side is winning. The aim of the moment is not to lose, but actually finding a way to win requires political changes in your opponent. And Ukraine, for all its suffering, I think will keep going. Russia keeps going so long as Putin wants it to, and so long as there's no challenge for him to him coming from within Moscow.
And how do you assess the strength of his position in Moscow? I mean, I appreciate he has obviously complete control of the political structures there, but he will be a paranoid man and he'll be worried about his position all the time. So do you think that the threat level against him has risen in recent weeks?
Well, he's made a point of keeping loyalists in positions, including at the top of the armed forces, which is why Gerasimov, who really has not had a very good war at all, their commander-in-chief, is still there. And those figures who opposed him coming out of the military conflict, Prigozhin last summer, the head of Wagner, Surovikin, who supported Prigozhin, if only indirectly, and was by far their best and most effective general, is basically been retired now. So he watches that. And then you've got the technocrats. I mean, as has been remarked a number of times, he's got lousy generals, but he's got very good economists, and they've really done an impressive job keeping the Russian economy afloat, managing the currency and all these things. But you can see they're feeling pretty tested by it all now as well. So this is why, and you saw yesterday, Zelensky was talking about a theory of victory, which you may think is optimistic, but it was clear he wasn't just relying on military means to achieve it. It's economic, which is why they keep on going for oil depots and refineries. It's political, diplomatic, which is why he had Indian Prime Minister Modi visiting and gave him as big a hug as Modi had given Putin, and so on. It's a whole series of things that add to the pressure. And when this works, if at all, it's very hard for us over here to say.
How should the West treat this moment? Is this now the time for the West to further loosen restrictions on how Western supplied weapons can be used inside Russia?
I think so. And this is a long running debate, and it's gone through many stages. I think initially the administration was nervous that one way or the other they were going to get drawn into a shooting war with Russia, and that would be very dangerous. And I think most analysts would probably agree with that. That's very dangerous. But you don't, and Putin, when he was actually making his more serious nuclear threats, it was about NATO coming in side by side with Ukraine. Every other red line they've talked about has now been passed. New countries joining NATO, F-16s are now flying in Ukraine. Russian territory is regularly being attacked. Long-range systems have been provided. All of these things have happened, and the war carries on without it turning into the Third World War. And so now we've got this one particular thing of whether or not Ukraine can use the longer range American systems and the British Storm Shadow, French Scalp, that cruise missiles that have American components in them to attack targets deep in Russia. The Ukrainians want to attack air bases. It's very reasonable, it seems to me, that they should be able to do so. So the pressure is building up on that. Note that the Ukrainians have now got a pretty impressive long-range drone that they're starting to use, and they announced yesterday that they've tested a ballistic missile. In the Soviet days, Ukraine built lots of missiles. I mean, it had a big defense industry. So I think that is, over time, the Ukrainians will do it themselves. But it seems to me unfortunate at this stage in the war that the Americans and the Ukrainians aren't wholly in lockstep about what's needed to do to get this war over.
And do you think Zelensky has a point? I mean, I think a lot of Ukrainians are frustrated when they feel as if their allies have been one step behind throughout this entire conflict. That, first they were told you couldn't have tanks, then they got tanks, then they were told you couldn't have F-16s, and they got F-16s. Now they're asking to use longer range missiles inside Russia. My sense is probably the West will move on it, but they might say we could have moved on it a year ago.
Yeah, I think that view is very strongly held. I mean, the Americans now are saying less about worrying about Russian red lines and more whether this is the right priority. It's not matters of the long range systems around. There are useful things to attack. Where the Americans don't mind, the Americans don't care if Crimea is attacked, because although the Russians think Crimea is Russian, the Americans and the Ukrainians don't, and so on, which indicates just this blurring of the boundaries here. So there are questions about priorities, but I think you get around that by having conversations on what makes sense, what it is that you, how the Ukraine can be best supported in what it's trying to do. There's another argument which is a bit retrospective, which is that in practice, this has all been very incremental, and so the Russians at each stage have been confronted with a line that's being crossed but isn't quite worth raising the whole temperature themselves about. It seems a small thing, and then another small thing happens. So it's the incrementalism has made it easier to increase support for Ukraine without getting into a major crisis with Russia. Again, I think there's some truth in that argument. But the fact is that the Ukrainians are paying daily the costs of this war. And so long as the Ukrainians think that they can subjugate the Ukrainians, they'll carry on. And somehow they've got to be disabused of that notion.
And just finally, Sir Lawrence, and this is a almost impossible question to answer, but I just want to invite you to speculate. When the history books are written of the war in Ukraine, how significant do you think the events of August 2024 and this incursion will be?
The war goes through stages, and you can identify the stages by an event such as this. So, September 2022, you had a successful Ukrainian incursion, which led to Russia doubling down, like Putin doubling down on his objectives, led to mobilization. You have the failed offensive last year. You've had a Russian offensive. So it's an important point in the war, and it changed the conversation. So in that sense, it'll be important. If this fails, I mean, if the Russians push on in Donetsk and the Ukrainians get pushed out of Kursk with losses in the process, then people will say it was a bold and audacious move, but a bit mad. If it then managed to establish themselves there and Russia is obliged to take more forces out of Ukraine, it will seem great and a very clever thing to do. But that's an argument that's still quite poised.
Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.